Amen. All right, fellas. Well, y'all going to have to bear with me tonight. I'm not feeling just 100%. I don't know if it's a sign of stuff or what's going on, but we're going to persevere and get through it. Nonetheless, so far, I know we didn't meet last week, so y'all probably forgot everything we talked about at this point. Nope. What have we been talking about? The second Exodus. Very good. Do what? We talked about a 400-year gap, 400 years of bondage leading up to the beginning of the Exodus. We talked about the new Egypt, which was who? Jerusalem. Very good. We looked at the new Moses, whose name was? Jesus. Very good. And then the last time we were together, we talked about the new bondage. Y'all remember what it was? The old covenant law? Well, that's what it was. We talked about how they were in bondage to the law, right? Y'all remember any of that at all? If you don't, you can go back and watch that lesson. Well, what I had planned on doing tonight, because I had 3 left until we break, I had planned on going through what we're going to go through tonight and then spending 2 weeks in the feast days. I know that some of y'all have asked about that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to try to teach you all 7 of them next week in a 25, 30-minute lesson. So it's going to be fun. I'm going to talk 100 miles an hour because I'm going to have to. But we'll burn that bridge when we get there. The feast days are very, very interesting if you're new to that concept. Creed, I know you've asked some stuff about it. So anyway, tonight what I want to talk about is a Bible word. It's not just a Bible word. It's a word that everybody knows, but it's the word generation. We're going to talk more specifically about what is a biblical generation. I'm seeing a 4 being thrown up over here. Creed already knows where we're going with this. But yeah, what we're gonna talk about in terms of this generation to define this is that transition period that they were going through in the first Exodus story. Y'all remember how I've kind of touched on this before that they crossed the Red Sea, right? So they were free, but we read in Joshua 5 that they weren't out from under the shame or the reproach of Egypt until they entered the land of Canaan. Y'all remember how long they wandered in the wilderness? Creed? Yep, 40 years. Very good. Now, what I want to show you tonight or make the case for is that 40 years was what the Bible defines as a generation, right? And we're going to see that exact same thing play out in the New Testament. All right, go to Exodus chapter 3 with me. That's where we're going to start our reading, and we'll go from there. And again, I'm just going to put this up here for a visual. From the time of their slavery till their freedom, we had a transition period, again, of 40 years. Y'all in Exodus 3? All right, verses 7 and 8. Somebody read it for me. Verses 7 and 8.
Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmakers. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites.
I set you up, didn't I?
And the Jebusites.
Yeah, and the Jebusites and all of them. Yeah, very good, Creed. Yeah, I can't pronounce those names either. That's all right. Yeah, so what we read there, number one, I want y'all to pay attention to where he says, I've seen the affliction of my people, because that's going to come in handy later. But in this text right here, God tells us point blank what he's about to accomplish in this Exodus, right? What he's about to get done. He says, number one, he's going to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, right? So we see he's going to deliver his people. And then what's he say? He's going to bring them to this good land, right? Or in other words, they're going to enter the land. This is a promised land. Y'all have heard that before, right? Talk of the promised land. So God is telling us explicitly, point blank, this is what I'm going to accomplish in the Exodus. Now, flip over to Numbers 13. You've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. So it's not that far. Numbers chapter 13. And before we read this, we need to really fast forward in the story a little bit. Most people believe that approximately 2 years or so have passed since Moses and the boys crossed the Red Sea, and whenever we read what we're about to read, right? So about 2 years, is that spot on? I have no idea. Really doesn't matter. I'm just making the point that this is next in the story, okay? But essentially what happens is Moses and his people, they arrive outside of the land of Canaan, and Moses is going to send some spies in there to go check this land out, the land that God told him he was going to give them. And we read this, Numbers 13. I'll read this because it's long. I'm sorry, this isn't the long one yet. We're going to read the long one in a minute. Numbers 13, 1 and 2 says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send men to spy out the land of where? Canaan. Spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. Is God being shady here about what he's about to do? I'm about to give you this land, right? And then he says, from each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them. So what land is God sending them in there to spy out? The land of Canaan. Very good, Braden. Yes, sir. The land, again, that God has already promised them multiple times. Boy, I hope you don't play like that tomorrow. That's terrible.
I hope they do.
Yeah, he has promised them this land he's going to give to his people. Now, here's the long one. If you're still in Numbers 13, start at verse 25. Read along with me. It says, at the end of how many days? Probably 40. You're not reading it, are you, Creed? Huh?
I'm not. I ain't there yet.
Okay. He says, at the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. This land's got fruit in it. Is fruit good or bad? Good. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it, I think I have a typo in here. He's saying we're going to overcome it, all right? I goofed that up. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, so we seemed to them. Big block of text. Y'all got all that? Let's recap. The spies went into the land for how many days? 40 days. And they came back. And did they give a good report or a bad report? Bad report. That's right. They essentially said, hey, we can't take this land, Moses, because the enemies are too great. Right? These guys are too big. There's too many of them. They're too strong. They're fortified. All this stuff. Now, this is the report they give to Moses, despite the fact that what had God promised them? The land. He promised he was going to give them the land, right? So let's put this another way. Did they accept or reject God's promise? They rejected it. They did not believe God. This, friends, is unbelief. God said, I'm going to do this. They said, we don't believe you, right? We reject that. Now, that was most of them. There were 2 men in the group that disagreed, that gave a good report. We read one here. It was Caleb. We learned later that Joshua also gave a good report. So you've got Caleb and Joshua who are faithful to God. They're faithful witnesses. They trusted God, whereas the others did not believe. Okay, y'all good on that? So we've got unbelief here. That's the point of reading that text. Now, one other thing to note, and we're not going to read this, but in Numbers 14, the next chapter, verses 1 through 5, we read explicitly that the people wanted to go back to Egypt. They said it's better to go be in bondage again than to get out here and die and face all this stuff. And again, did they believe God or not? No. They did not believe God was good to fulfill His promise. So, how do we think God would respond to their unbelief? Well, you guys already know, but go to Numbers 14, turn the page. Starting in verse 26, this is another long block, so y'all read with me. Numbers 14, 26 through 35. It says, and the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, how long shall this wicked congregation, does your Bible say something different there? No, okay. This wicked congregation, just want you to hold on to that.
Hold on, where are we supposed to be at?
Numbers 14, verse 26. Well, that was in 27.
Yeah. Wait, look at what I see. Does it say 13?
No, you're 15, aren't you?
Come on, Harper.
Oh,
You're at 15.
I turned one page too far.
14 comes before 15.
20 is right.
Yeah.
All right, you're good. Verse 28. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward who have grumbled against me. not one shall come into the what? Into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. But your little ones, who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall lie in the wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness for how long? 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. Look at verse 34. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, which was how many? 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this will I do to all this wicked congregation who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall come to a full end, and there they shall die. Pretty clear cut, right? They didn't trust God, so for every day they were in there spying it out, He's going to give them a year to judge them, basically. So because of their unbelief, and y'all got to get this, God would have them spend the next 40 years in the wilderness until the unbelievers died off. And remember what He called them twice there, a wicked congregation. Y'all with me? Good. Stay with me. I want to show you something. There's a parallel text in Deuteronomy 1. And if you want to flip over there, you can. But I want to point something out to you before we jump to the New Testament, and I show you really where we're going with this. Okay? Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 35 and 36. Now remember, he's calling them there an evil what? Congregation. Yeah. All right, Deuteronomy 1, 35 and 36. And again, it's a parallel text telling the same story, same point in time. He says, not one of these men of this what?
Generation.
That's right. Mine says evil generation. So we've moved from evil congregation to evil generation. Not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give your fathers, except Caleb, and of course we know Joshua too. But the point there is, we see that the group of people that were going to die off in the wilderness are called an evil what?
Evil generation.
Evil generation, that's right. And in Numbers, we learned that they would spend how many years wandering in the wilderness? 40 years. All right, we're good on this. No questions so far, right? Good. Let's jump to the New Testament, all right? And I want to ask you something before we go where we're going. Putting the two together between an evil generation and this 40-year wandering, like how long of a time period could we say at this point is fair that the Bible authors would consider to be a biblical generation? 40 years, right? It makes sense. He says, I'm going to kill this generation, and we know that that's going to be a 40-year stretch. Therefore, generation's 40 years. Is that mathing?
Yeah.
Y'all jiving? Okay.
Matthew what? 4?
We're going to go to Hebrews 3 first. But we will wind up in Matthew. Hebrews 3 first. And in Hebrews chapter 3, the author is going to quote from Psalm 95. Now, do y'all remember what it's called when the New Testament author quotes from the Old Testament? Big fancy, huh? Yeah, Hebrews 3. Big fancy M word called metalepsis, right? Remember where they're pulling on the Old Testament text to give us greater understanding? Okay, the author of Hebrews quotes from Psalm 95 in verses 7 through 11. He says, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the what? Wilderness. Where does that ring a bell? Well, we just read about that evil congregation dying off in the wilderness, right? It's exactly what he's talking about. Verse 9, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for how long? 40 years. Therefore, I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. To put that another way, they shall not enter the land. Right? Okay, he told them, remember in Numbers, he told them your children are going to get the promise because you didn't believe me, basically. So, point is, here we've got the author of Hebrews saying that the fathers who tested God in the wilderness wandering, that's the Exodus, right? For 40 years, were a generation. And it's the same thought we saw in Numbers and Deuteronomy. So we can say that Old Testament and New Testament share this thought. You see that? They're all on the same page. Nobody's making stuff up here. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are some cases where you could argue, and I'm not going to get into this tonight, but you could argue in some cases that a generation could be 70 years or it could be 100 years. But normatively speaking, when we see that word generation, and in the Greek, now let me write this out for you. It's Guinea or Guinea. That's an A, by the way, Harper. I know you like to rag on me. But normatively speaking, when we see this word in the New Testament, how long should we consider that time period? 40 years. That's right. Very good. Go to Matthew 23. You brought up Matthew. Let's do that. I think I'm good on time. Now, Matthew 23. Are y'all familiar with this text at all? It's like it's a doozy. All right. Matthew 23 is basically Jesus' showdown with the religious leaders in the temple, like right before he gives the Olivet discourse and then goes to the upper room or whatever, and then he's crucified, right? So more or less, for all intents and purposes, this is like his last big crescendo run-in with these guys. And basically what happens is he's in the temple, and if you read the parallel accounts like Luke and Mark, the synoptic gospels, so you see this widow give, it was called a lepta, like teeny tiny amount of money in these big offering pans that they had, and it just sets Jesus off because these religious guys, they were all rich, right? And they would come dump all their stuff in to make this big show. Well, this lady comes in with this authentic act of worship, giving everything that she has, right? Which is basically nothing. And it just, I don't know if it directly says that's what sets Jesus off, but that's what happens, and then Matthew 23 happens, okay? This big run-in. Well, he's duking it out with these religious leaders. He's calling them a pit of snakes, whitewashed tombs full of dead people's bones, just hammering them. He says, you'll travel land and sea to make a convert and make them twice the son of hell as you. I mean, laying the lumber to them, right? He's promising this judgment that's going to come on them. And then look at verse 32. 32 and following. He says, fill up then the measure of your who? Not there yet, are you? Matthew 23, verse 32.
Fathers.
Fill up then the measure of your fathers. We just read about their fathers in Hebrews 3, didn't we? Yeah. You serpents, you brood of vipers, snakes, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on who? What's it say? On you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Excuse me. Truly I say to you, how many of these things does it say? All these things will come upon who? This generation. Very good. And then he goes on in verse 38 to say, see, your house is left to you desolate. And then he and the disciples turn and they walk out of the temple. Okay? Tough, right? Tough coming from Jesus Christ. Laying the lumber to them. So in this confrontation with these religious leaders, Jesus predicts that a judgment is going to come upon who? This generation, right? It's going to come on them, including the desolation of their house, which we could say is the temple. Okay, he says, your house is left you desolate. So let's ask the question then. How many years is Jesus giving for the time frame on this judgment? If we're going to be consistent and say that a generation is 40 years, he's locking himself in here, right? He's promising this is going to come. All these things are going to come on this generation. So how many years does this have to come true, to come to pass? 40 years, right? Or else we've butchered the whole thing. But if we're...
What makes it believe that
God came back.
yeah.
Don't get ahead of me. Don't get ahead of me. Yeah. But I mean, does that make sense? Y'all are following me on the 40-year being a generation thing. Jesus promises all these things are going to come upon this generation. Therefore, all these things, which is this judgment that he's going to bring on their heads, has to happen within 40 years, right? We're good there. Okay, good. Let's keep reading. The next thing that happens, they walk out of the temple and they go to the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus begins the Olivet discourse. Well, here's what's happening. He says, see, your house is left to you desolate. And the disciples are like, you talking about that temple over there? And Jesus says, truly I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. The whole thing's going to come down. Okay? Well, then they ask him, well, what will be the sign? When are these things going to be? What will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? And Jesus goes on to tell them, look, all this stuff's going to happen before that. You're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. There is going to be famines, pestilences. The gospel's going forth to the whole world, the whole oikumene, which is the known world, the Roman Empire. He tells them all these things are going to happen. And then look, Matthew 24:34. I want y'all to read it with me. Huh? Matthew 24:34. He says, truly I say to you. Now let's pause. Who's the you there that he's talking to?
To the
It's his disciples at this point, right? Is it me and you today? No, but that's how people read the Bible. They think you is me. No, you, if you read Luke's account, I think, it may be Mark's, it explicitly tells you which disciples he's talking to, okay? He says, truly I say to you, this what? This generation will not pass away until some of this stuff happens. Is that what it says?
Until
all these things take place. So, you've got this generation then of wicked, religious, apostate leaders that are going to see a judgment. And then he's telling his disciples, all this stuff, all these things I'm predicting are going to happen within your generation, right? All of them. He doesn't even leave it up to chance that maybe some of them wouldn't be. So once again, he's promising his disciples this is going to come about within how many years?
40.
Okay, he's making some bold claims here. Y'all agree with that, right? Because if he's wrong and it doesn't come to pass, guess what that makes Jesus? A liar, and more specifically, a false prophet. Now, according to Jewish law, what were they to do with false prophets?
Kill him.
That's right. That's right. You reject them and you kill them, right? Because they're false prophets. So, I just turned my thing over and completely lost my spot in my notes. All right. Most commentators agree that Jesus was speaking these words that we're reading right now and would be crucified later, sometime between the year AD 30 and AD 33. Okay? So let me write this down here. If it's the year 33 and it's a generation, it has to happen within a generation. Yes, Harper, that gives him until 73 AD, right? Because that's 40 years. Y'all with it? You following me? Now, I believe this was 30 AD when he was crucified, but whatever. I'm not going to die on that hill tonight. The point is, between 70 and 73 AD, however you want to slice it, this stuff has to happen. The judgment has to happen, and all these things that he tells the disciples they're going to see, they have to happen before that. Well, let's ask the question then. Can we prove that the things Jesus predicted, including the destruction of the temple, came to pass within those 40 years? Yeah, we absolutely can. Let me give you one example. Jesus tells them in the Olivet discourse, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Okay? You guys, how old are y'all? Like, you're between 13 and 16, something like that? Y'all's entire life, has there not been a war going on somewhere in this world? Right. I mean, always, right? I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine last year and everybody lost their minds. You know, they're like, wars and rumors of wars. It's not unusual for us to hear of wars. Right? That's the point I'm trying to make. You know when it was? When they lived in a time called the Pax Romana, which means the peace of Rome, which is when Jesus is speaking these words. During the Pax Romana, this was basically considered a golden age for the Roman Empire because there were relatively no wars whatsoever. So does it make more sense for you and me when we hear of another war pop up on the news that we need to freak out and get ready? Or does it make more sense that if we lived in a time of no war, then when we hear of a war, that ought to cause us to perk up a little bit? Yeah, well, guess what? According to Josephus and Tacitus, between 33 and 73, wars started popping up all over the place, right after he predicted all this stuff was about to happen. So there's one. So did his disciples hear of wars and rumors of wars? Yeah, they did. Another one was the gospel being preached to the whole world, or whole oikumene. That's the Greek word. Now, we think whole world, we're thinking globe, right? Whole planet. That's not the way they thought. When they read oikumene, they took that to be their known world. You might just call it the Roman Empire, okay? That's the area they were familiar with. And we have to ask the question, well, did the gospel go forth to the whole world, to the whole oikumene? Well, according to Paul in Romans 10:18, and this is one example of many, guys. There's a bunch, okay? This is one example, Romans 10:18. Speaking on the gospel going forth, he says, their sound has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. So according to Paul, the book of Romans, depending on when you want to say it was written, let's call it 50-something, had the gospel gone out to the whole world? Yes, according to an inspired apostle, yes it had. Okay, so did his disciples see that come true? Okay, he says there's going to be famines, pestilences. Y'all know what a pestilence is? Like a disease, like a plague, okay? He says there's going to be earthquakes. Well, there's some historical writings from Suetonius and Seneca and all these other old dead guys y'all have never heard of. And guess what they testify about? The fact that there were famines, pestilences, and earthquakes during that time period. Like insanely so. Well, what's one big one that we've already talked about? What spurred this whole conversation with the disciples? The temple, right? What about the temple going down? Jesus told them that not one stone would be left upon another, okay, whenever this came to pass. And then again, we agreed that it had to happen within 40 years. Well, guess what happened? Let me give you a little history lesson. In the year 66, all this tension was building between the Romans and the Jews, okay? In 66, a guy named General Cestus Gallus comes to Jerusalem, marches on them with his troops. They have a little battle, all right, and nobody really knows why, but Cestus Gallus withdrew from this little battle. So they go and leave. Well, guess what all the Christians do? They get out of town. They flee to the mountains of Pella, which is interesting because in the Olivet discourse, Jesus says, when you see all this stuff happening, flee to the mountains. So God gives them a chance. They listened to Jesus. They got out of there. In the spring of 67, a guy named, so this is 8 months later, right? A guy named General Vespasian comes back in, and they go to all-out war by the decree of Emperor Nero on all the Jews basically in the Roman Empire, right? They're all out slaughtering them for 3.5 years. The thing culminates in the fall of AD 70, right? We said this could be 30 to 70. So in the fall of...
Is that why you think it's 70?
100%. So in the fall of AD 70, the guys come in, they finally break through Jerusalem, they tear the walls down, they tear the temple down, they slaughter over 1 million people. This judgment that Jesus promises was going to happen within a generation, within 40 years, guess what happened 40 years later? It came to pass, right? And here's the deal. Jesus told them not one stone would be left upon another. This is pretty interesting. So I think it was Titus at this point. It might have been Vespasian. He didn't want them to hurt the temple. He didn't want them to burn it down. But somehow or another, the temple caught on fire. Well, you know what the temple was decorated with? A bunch of gold, like all over the place. Well, guess what happens when gold gets hot? It melts. Where does it go when it melts? It goes to the ground. So history records that when that temple burned, all the gold melted. He sent his troops in there, and they dug that thing up stone by stone to get that gold out. Remember Jesus saying not one stone will be left upon another? That's fulfillment, boys. And it happened exactly how he said it would. Y'all think that's cool? Because I sure do. Now, we'll look at this more in depth. Well, it was going to be in 2 weeks, but we're going to have to make it next week. But the destruction of the temple, it marked the consummation of their freedom in the first century. If you look at the book of Hebrews, they're waiting to enter the land. They're waiting to enter rest. And when would it come? It would come at the destruction of the old covenant, right? Which was the destruction of the temple and the people and all that. Now, the New Testament goes out of its way to call that generation an evil or wicked generation. There's multiple references. You've got Jesus, gospel writers, Paul. They're all saying they were living in an evil or wicked generation, just like the unbelievers in what story? The Exodus, that's right. The New Testament goes out of its way to make the point that people are going back or wanting to go back, just like the people did in what story? The Exodus story. Another thing I wanted to point out, you remember God says, I've seen your affliction or whatever, and I'm going to rescue you from that. In the book of 2 Thessalonians, Paul's writing to the church at Thessalonica, and he's talking about those that are afflicting you and how God's going to bring affliction on your afflictors. It's the same language, guys. It's telling the same story again. So just like in the Exodus, at the end of the 40 years, or we may say a what? A generation. The faithful would go on to inherit the land. Now, in the first century, did the Christians inherit a physical land?
No.
Nope. But Hebrews 12:22 tells us, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, a heavenly Jerusalem. Not a physical land, not a physical city. It's all heavenly. And this is a fulfillment of Isaiah 2, which was a prophecy about where the nations would stream to Mount Zion, and the day of the Lord would bring judgment and salvation. But it would mark the end of the second Exodus. Okay? And I want y'all to see that the Bible is telling the exact same story in the New Testament that it told in the Old, and that is the story of the Exodus, of God bringing His people from slavery to freedom, that they may dwell in the land and live with Him. So, what do we do with this teaching? I don't have anything super in depth for you tonight because I think this one's pretty simple, right? Would y'all say today that we live in an evil generation?
Yes.
Me too, right? Does that mean we're the evil generation the Bible's talking about with all this stuff? No, it doesn't. But sure, it's no secret, guys. You turn the TV on, you walk outside, there's evil everywhere, right? We see that. So how do we respond to that? We don't follow the flow of our generation, right? We follow King Jesus. And it really is that simple.
Go to Mount Zion.
We go to Zion, Braden says. Couldn't agree more. That's the place to be. Y'all have any questions?
Good teaching.
You don't have nothing after that? All right. Cool. Well, let's pray.